Also because this is, for me, I don't know about the other speakers, but it's my first in-person speaking event in nearly 2 years. So, I don't know about you, but I'll be totally honest. At lunchtime today, I was feeling a bit overwhelmed. Has anybody else had a feeling of being overwhelmed, or kind of your head is about to just go like worms? I think it's partly because we haven't been in person for such a long time. Also because we're kind of just, our brains are kind of trying to absorb lots of different stimulus. So you'll be glad to hear this afternoon. I'm not going to bombard you with facts and figures. I think we've heard enough of the analysis of what's happening. I'm not going to show you pictures either. I'm going to tell you a story. So if you want to shut your eyes at any point, I won't be offended. It's up to you. I really want to just offer this as a story for you. It's my own story of ecological conversion. And perhaps you'll take something from it. You'll get from it whatever you need at this moment. Because I'm a firm believer that there is a lot to be said, and I might provoke you to think about your own ecological conversion story. There's a lot to be said in how we tell our stories and how we share our stories at this moment in time. So really feel free. And maybe if someone starts snoring, the person next to them might give them a little nudge. So I'm not going to go right back to the very start because I don't want to bore you with all the details. I live in Ireland. I live in Renewal with my husband and 2 kids. And I grew up in Scotland, you might have noticed. I was born in Glasgow and grew up in Falkirk. And I grew up in the shadow of a big oil refinery, Grangemouth. And I always remember as a child being totally kind of taken by this strange thing that was down the road from us. And often at night it would light up the sky bright orange. And kind of apocalyptic scenes at night time, especially on a winter's night. But it also made me aware as I was growing up and thinking about these issues of climate change, that there's a lot at stake for people when it comes to change. Because nearly everybody in our street worked in the factory in Grangemouth, in the oil refinery. And then my mum's brother worked in the oil rigs, and even now my sister's husband works on the oil rigs. So making a change is a very personal matter as well. It involves personal change at every level in communities. But I'll fast forward to Laudato Si, because that's what I really want to talk about. When Laudato Si landed on my desk, I was working in Drogheda, the sister agency of CAFOD. I read it through the eyes of motherhood. I'd recently become a mum of 2 boys, just as Pope Francis was penning this encyclical. And I was becoming increasingly concerned about the state of our world. And as I opened Laudato Si, the first words of that encyclical just jumped off the page at me. Father Eamon already quoted them last night, but I'll repeat them. Our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life, a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. It felt to me, reading Laudato Si, that motherhood, or our capacity to mother and to be mothered, was also somehow on Pope Francis' mind. As a long-term activist and academic, I was well aware of the facts of what is happening to our world. Having worked on these issues for over 20 years in Drogheda, I'd seen the deterioration happening pretty fast. And I was starting to question the value of all the effort that the environmental movement had put in over those decades. So much effort for so little return. or so it seemed. At the same time, the stark injustices of climate change and the devastation this was having on people's lives across the world was very, very clear. Yet I thought I was doing my bit. I have to say, I thought, working in Chokra, I was doing my bit. And I thought that was enough, given that I had 2 little boys and a family to contend with. But it also felt completely inadequate in the face of what is happening in the world. As I read Laudato Si in detail, I kept having to pause, as I'm sure many of you have when you read it, with the wonderful turns of phrase and thought-provoking ideas that just jump out at you. As Father Eamon outlined last night, told us many of these phrases that Pope Francis uses. I realised that this encyclical was something really special, that had an appeal far beyond the confines of the Catholic Church. And as I kept reading on, I had this really powerful image in my mind. It was my 2 kids, and them grown men, in a world that had become desolate. What kind of world was I leaving behind for them? What more could I do to change the destructive course the world seemed to be on? I started to question parenting. What is parenting? And to me, parenting, at its very essence, is about building that bridge between the past, the present, and the future. As parents, we largely inherit the world from who has gone before. We want to equip our children for the future and do our bit to ensure that their future is as good, if not better, than the life that we have had. And yet, everything I read in Laudato Si and knew about the climate crisis pointed in the opposite direction. Against this backdrop of just becoming a mum, of parental love, the kaleidoscope of devastation depicted by Pope Francis in Laudato Si, I have to confess, had me quickly in tears. Are we really bequeathing debris and desolation to our children? Or in Pope Francis' language, a pile of filth? Those tears of sadness and of anger provoked by Laudato Si were a pivotal moment for me in my personal ecological conversion. Up till then, I had perhaps allowed a disconnect to creep in between what I knew to be true about the climate crisis in my head, what I felt about it in my heart, and what I actually did about it. This sense of cognitive and affective dissonance is so widespread in our society. In many ways, it has become a coping strategy, a mechanism to deflect blame and to enable us to avoid taking action. Somehow Laudato Si, however, managed to break straight through that sense of disconnect for me. The message of Pope Francis was not a harsh one, although it was very hard-hitting. It read more like a love letter to the earth, illuminated by a deep sense of care, of tenderness, overflowing from a heart full of maternal love. It enabled me to reconnect with the situation the world is in, but not in a disempowering way. Yes, I experienced a wave of grief, but I didn't feel abandoned in that place of grief, as I had done reading many other environmental books. I felt gently but firmly encouraged to move through that pain into hope and even joy. I felt a liberation in truthful acceptance of where we are today and a new energy to act. And action for me meant and continues to mean many things. It really has become a way of life. First and foremost, Laudato Si completely changed my own relationship with creation. It underpinned a love that had been instilled in me from a young child of nature. And it instilled a deep theological understanding of God's mystical presence in creation. In fact, my kind of natural reaction on reading Laudato Si was to run outside and exclaim, Laudato Si, praise be. This unfolding realization, this spiritual awakening of the mystical presence of Christ in the whole cosmos changed everything. It raised up in me a sense of mystical communion with the great story of creation. And once you find that, there's a pure joy in sensing God's presence around us, that mystical presence, and a sense of wonder that nothing, no fear, no doubt can extinguish. This change within me changed the way I parented, the way I related to my children. For us, everything became wrapped up then in the story of tender care for each other and for the earth. And don't get me wrong, I am no perfect mother by any means, and we have many, many challenges, so I'm not painting this nirvana kind of picture of Pollyanna. It's challenging being a mum and bringing up boys. But our focus became one of being outside. Because I realised that when we're outside together, we relate differently together. Learning about nature and through nature, caring for creatures together, became a major focus for us. And as a mother, I wanted above all to teach my children about the wonderful Mother Earth that God has gifted to us, and to nurture in each other a deep appreciation of the beauty around us. Many times when the children were younger, we would go for walks in the woods, and it would become a natural place for catechesis. Sometimes it's hard in modern life to wonder, how do you instill the faith in the next generation? Because it's a different environment. But nature provides the beautiful, natural setting for catechesis. The boys would naturally, themselves, ask the questions. Who made all this, Mummy? Why did God give us such a beautiful gift? Where do the creatures all go when they die? Such big questions, and together we would explore the answers. I'll never forget one moment with my older son going down to his grandmother's. And we went for a walk along an old bog road. And in Ireland, the bog roads are where they used to cut the turf. Well, they still do, but they're not meant to anymore. But they're kind of high-lined kind of walls on the sides of them because they've dug down the turf. And it was a lovely, sunny day like this, and there were wild flowers everywhere. And I said, come on, we'll pick some wild flowers for Granny and bring them back up to the house. And he was just kind of playing with the flowers, and he turned round to me, we were picking flowers, and he said, Mum, Mother Earth's hair is so beautiful. I thought, that's a bit odd. And then he picked a flower and he said, do you think she can feel it when we pull it out? And it made my hair stand on end, because I realised that children have such a natural sensitivity and connection to nature. And it's one of the tragedies of today that so young people and children are exposed so little to that natural relationship that's so life-giving to them. So much of their lives is mediated by screens and by virtual reality. So this newfound sense of connection with nature and a connection to, as a family around Laudato Si, grew in me this urge to do more, to ask what more can I do to try and try and protect our earth and safeguard it for the next generation. And Laudato Si was the inspiration for me to capture my experiences in my book, Climate Generation, Awakening to Our Children's Future. And it's just a small book and simply written as a story of awakening, really written for other parents, because I became so aware that this sense of the kind of tragedy on the horizon was not apparent to so many parents. They just don't know what's around the corner. None of us do, but we certainly aren't conscious of the climate crisis. So in the book, I simply share my perspective on motherhood and a sense of spiritual awakening, and how that's changed me as a person and how I engage with others across the world. I started to realise that this feeling I had, this sense of wanting to take action after Laudato Si, was something that was happening all over the world. And right in my community in Ireland, together, I started to bump into people, meet people using social media, exchanging ideas, making plans. We met up in prayer groups, in book clubs, in environmental groups to study Laudato Si. And over time, we developed a sense of a movement, emerging, led by lay people and youth. And at the heart of this was the global Catholic climate movement, which has emerged in the past few years as a vibrant network of networks, sustaining and nurturing ecological conversion right across the world. And the mission of that movement is just so simple: to turn Laudato Si into a lived reality. And it feels like we are just at the beginning. 6 years after the encyclical, the challenges we face today as a world have only deepened. None of us can deny, as been said many times over the past 2 days, that the times we're living in are truly extraordinary. The past couple of years have turned everybody's lives upside down. All of us have seen disruption in major ways. For many of us, it has been a strange paradox of forced changes to our lives, bringing much stress and uncertainty, but also a certain simplicity. And we know sadly that the nightmare of this pandemic is not over by a long shot. The story has a long way to run, not least because of the deep inequalities in our world, which mean that only a tiny fraction of us will be fully vaccinated anytime soon, and many thousands more will perish. The pandemic is hugely relevant to what happens now in relation to climate change and tackling the ecological crisis, and especially the COP in Glasgow. We know that we cannot be healthy on a sick planet. The phenomenon of ILF that Mark so beautifully outlined this morning is already very clear. The backdrop, or perhaps the foreground, of pandemic politics is the context which we are now living and working. It affects so many aspects: how we meet together, who can and cannot travel to meet, how much resources are available, and the levels of energy and focus we have to tackle the issues. The pandemic is happening in a world which is deeply divided and where divisions are deepening. Yet the pandemic is teaching us important lessons about ourselves and about our world that perhaps as a species, as a human family, we had ignored for far too long. In his beautiful book, Lighter's Dream, which has already been mentioned several times, Pope Francis talks about the fact that the definition of crisis is change. You cannot come out of a crisis the same as you went in. Crisis is defined by change. The pandemic is a crisis, and therefore none of us will come out the way we went in. And because the crisis is global, it changes all of us. It becomes a shared experience. And what Pope Francis says is that whilst this change is inevitable, how we change, we don't know how exactly we'll be changed. We have choices. We can choose how to respond. We can react with anger, selfishness, fear, or we can choose to respond with solidarity, kindness, and compassion. In other words, the moment we're living in, this moment of crisis, can become a moment of kairos, an opportune moment for positive change, if we allow it to. Just think of the outcomes of other major crises in history. The Second World War. It was the most awful tragedy, with millions of deaths, the Holocaust. But out of it came the United Nations, major global institutions, international law, human rights, the welfare state, the NHS. Whilst by no means perfect, out of crisis came an era defined by international cooperation and the rallying cry, never again. History, like individual human lives, is built on cycles of tragedy and rebirth, dying and reimagining society. It's an opportunity to change the story, to reframe the story, as John talked about, talked about this morning. Arundhati Roy, the Indian author, spoke of the current pandemic as being a portal, because everything is shaken to the core. The pandemic becomes a time to choose what aspects of society it enables us to shake off and which we want to carry into the future. We have experienced this in our own lives over the past 2 years. Somehow the pandemic is teaching us about deep connection. We are all connected to each other and to nature. This is no longer a theory for us. It's an undeniable lived experience that has affected so many different aspects of our life. The forced separations and the absence of that connection has shone a light on who we really are. The pandemic has taught us other important lessons too, that are critical to tackling the climate crisis. In particular, it's teaching us what it means to come together to face a common threat. Greta Thunberg and the climate strikers called for the world to treat the climate crisis like the emergency it is. We know the scientists have told us we're currently on a warming path which will render large parts of the world unlivable by the end of the century. And because of the time it takes to effect change everywhere, you can't just switch off the coal station unless there's something, a renewable energy station or alternatives built. You can't magic up the green alternatives to transport. They take physical time to build. The actions we take in the next few years will determine everything for the next decades. Whilst governments eventually called climate emergencies on the back of all the protests, virtually nothing changed. The strikers accused them of declaring emergencies in words only. And Greta used that famous analogy of the house on fire. If your house is burning, you don't sit around and have a detailed, considered discussion to the nature of the fire, whether it's really happening or not, how hot it is, or how long it will take for the house to burn down. You take emergency action to put out the fire, and then you talk about the rest. Before the pandemic, human society had largely forgotten what it means to take collective action in a crisis, to act together. We had become completely sold on the idea that it's enough for each one of us to follow our individual self-interest, to do what's right for us in the short term, in order to have a good outcome for everybody. We become wrapped up in the false notion that market-driven economics, endless economic growth, would save us from ourselves and the ravages of climate change. We had devalued the potential that we have to act together for a greater good, and the fact that we can even do so. In fact, I think as societies, before the pandemic, we didn't really believe we could face a crisis together. And the pandemic, however flawed the response has been, has taught us huge lessons. Particularly, we can bend curves together. We know what a curve is, and we can bend them together when we all play our part. We can do impossible things, like invent and roll out vaccines in record time, lock down our economies to save countless lives, get public information out to vast numbers of people, put in place safety nets for the vulnerable. As I say, nothing is perfect, but we've demonstrated to ourselves that responsible collective action, guided by solidarity and and enlightened self-interest perhaps, is the most powerful tool we have in a crisis, not blind market forces. Because governments could have quite easily said, oh sure we won't, and in fact at the start they were kind of playing that game. Sure, we won't lock down properly, we have to protect jobs. But then there was a shift because I think the reality of the nature of the crisis made it so unpalatable to put the economy in front of people's lives. We understood what was at play if they made those choices. Moreover, we taught ourselves and our political system what an emergency response actually looks like. It's interesting and certainly thought-provoking to think that on the whole, the pandemic has meant that the younger generations who face less, though not completely less, threat from the pandemic, from the virus, made huge sacrifices to protect the older generations. And when it comes to climate action, it's the reverse that is asked of us. It's the older generations that are being asked to step up first for the sake of protecting the younger generations. And this is what's at stake in Glasgow. So now that there's a hankering to get back to normal, there's an equally strong sense that we need to create this new normal. We are deeply conscious that the old normal was unsustainable in so many ways, including the environmental perspective. The challenge now is to create a new normal which breaks with those cycles of environmental destruction and points to a clear pathway to a different future. We have many of the building blocks for that future, and Mark outlined many of them this morning. But what is lacking at this point is the ability to see beyond the narrow frame we have drawn for ourselves. Shifting this frame is no easy task, as the future has to be guided by different values and how these are translated into key policy choices in the years to come. In the face of all this, what can each of us do to shift the dial? How can we do our part, however small, to respond to Laudato Si and ensure that we emerge from this pandemic in the context of climate change and ecological destruction without going back to our old ways, but we capitalise on this moment as a kairos to tackle the climate emergency. So much is riding on whether each one of us shows up at this unique moment of truth in history. There are many practical things we can do. And in fact, this whole weekend, the fact we've showed up and we're here shows that we are embracing this change. And we'll talk more about the practicalities this evening. We need to focus on listening to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. One word I want to stress that I haven't heard too much so far, but which is absolutely critical to how we embrace Laudato Si and move forward, is community. In fact, the vision of ecological conversion of Pope Francis is quite specific. He qualifies it by saying we need a community conversion. And for me, this focus on community is really like a magic ingredient we have been missing. We usually associate conversion experiences as something intensely personal. And of course it is personal, and my own experience is deeply personal. But it's not the case that it's ever completely personal. Conversion is almost always something that's mediated by another person. We don't discover our faith by ourselves. It's handed down to us. So what does it mean to converge together as a community? What would it take for all of us in this room to be converted together, to undergo a community conversion? What if that process of community ecological conversion was extended to the entire church, to the entire world of faith communities? that, believe it or not, still encompass 80% of the people who walk on the planet. A community conversion involves us together repenting, agreeing to follow through our new understanding in a spirit of synodality, changing our institutional structures, making and following through on clear plans, and ritualising our change as a community through things like the season of creation. Once you think about conversion on the scale of community, it is a truly extraordinarily powerful phenomenon. And as people of faith, the how of what we do is so important as the what. Conversion is about stepping into a new reality, that metanoia that Eamon talked about. It's about stepping into that reality, inhabiting the future. Pope Francis talks about prepare the future, not prepare for the future. He always stresses this, prepare the future. And how you prepare the future is you inhabit that future that you want to see. Given the often overwhelming sense of ecological crisis, it can at times seem hopeless. And people often ask me, how can you be so optimistic about the future? And I say, I'm not an optimist, but I definitely believe my experience is the same as what Greta Thunberg has said. Hope comes when you act. That you can take action as an act of will. Sometimes you have to have that act of will, you might not feel it. But once you start to act, you start to feel hope. And that sense of hope builds and builds. As Christians and as parents, we cannot give up. We have to believe in a new future, that God's kingdom can emerge, that death and destruction is never the end of the story. And we have to approach this future in a spirit of hope and renewal, like in the pangs of childbirth. I'm ever grateful for the coincidence of becoming a mother just as Laudato Si was being published. And I'd like to end just by sharing a little encounter that reminded me of this motherly connection. Just last year, on the eve of the COVID crisis, I had the great joy of meeting Pope Francis in a private audience with the board of GCCN. We sat round in a circle together and we discussed our Laudato Si stories, our stories of ecological conversion, for well over an hour. We shared how that ecological conversion, personal conversion, had sparked a community, a movement. I shared with them the gist of some of the things I just shared with you, moved by a great gratitude for the gift that Pope Francis has given us, and for the gift of Pope Francis himself. At the end of the meeting, spontaneously, as is often the case with Pope Francis, he told us to follow him outside. He wanted to show us something. It was a beautiful tapestry of the birthing of the universe. The tapestry reflected the act of giving birth, strong yet gentle hands, and a newborn baby emerging from the darkness into light. The Pope used the moment for a little catechesis. Explained to us that the tapestry reflects the courage and the tenderness with which we need to act today. Then he urged us, this is how we need to be as we live Laudato Si. We all need to be mothers now. And in that moment, I have to say, I felt my little story of awakening was perfectly reflected. Thank you.